Wow, look at that. I never get applause for my part. That's fantastic. Yeah. I have to admit, it has been a few years since Carney has been involved in a talk here, and I always forget about what a fire hazard they are. But I want to welcome you all for coming out here tonight. My name is Cliff Lobby. I'm the programs director here at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, and we are really, really excited to be hosting this Team Town Historian program this evening. Shannon, Butler, and Carney Rhinevault are great friends. I was talking earlier about how Arcadia, the publisher, reached out to me, and I got this sort of form letter that I tend to get in my job from a publicist saying, "Dear friend, I want to tell you about an exciting new book by so-and-so and so-and-so," and it was a riot because my reply was basically like, okay, you're introducing me to people that are pretty much like my family around the Thanksgiving table. Both Carney and Shannon have had a long history with the library. They, of course, Shannon as park ranger for many years, Carney as town historian, and maybe most prolific town historian, certainly in the last few decades, as far as writing. His fifth time here, Carney? Is this your fifth gig? Yeah, fifth gig. So we're really excited to have them here talking about their new book, Hyde Park in the Gilded Age. If you've not gotten it, if you've not seen it yet, please get it. We'll be selling it and doing a book signing outside later. On with the show.
Okay. Well, first I have to thank everyone at the Presidential Library Museum, especially Cliff, for helping make this whole thing happen. We want to thank the folks at Arcadia Press for encouraging us to create this book. And I have to thank Carney. Carney has been the town historian he was the town historian for a long time and has written several books. And he came to me and said, "Look, kid, I've got," oh, thank you. Can you hear me in the back? He said, "Look, kid, I've got all kinds of books under my belt, but you need one under yours. And now that you're our new town historian, let's make this happen." So I have to thank you for inviting me to come and do this book with you. Carney and I wanted to take a close and intimate look at the Gilded Age. And there are many angles of the Gilded Age, as a matter of fact. The term itself is satirical in nature, being the creation of authors Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warren. And their book, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, actually focused on the greed and political corruption of what is essentially a very complex era. And to make a long story short, what they did was they kind of showed this excessive yet thin layer of gold over a very complicated time period. And our book, which is a mere 127 pages long, and designed more to stimulate the visual pleasures more so than the academic, what we tried to do was to put together a sampling of some really neat images and stories to kind of focus on what we believe are two very important parts of the Gilded Age of Hyde Park: the local families and the river families. And so we wanted to showcase the gilded layer, the ostentatious lifestyles, the elaborate interiors, the beautiful mansions, and we also wanted to focus on what became known as the other half, the people who made that comfortable lifestyle possible, the servants, the little guys, the hard workers. The interesting thing about this town is that the servants did all the work, and their descendants are the ones prospering today. The Gilded Age left its mark on Hyde Park, for better or worse. Mansions, formal gardens, purposely, meticulously kept landscapes, servants' quarters, boathouses, greenhouses, a little bit of everything. Hyde Park got much of its character from this era. Even FDR, who served as a town historian like us, he was well aware of the significance of that era when he determined that Vanderbilt Mansion should be made a national park. And he convinced Margaret Van Allen to hand it over to the federal government for preservation. So the Vanderbilt mansion is sort of a dedication to that era. The images in our work come from several different sources. Some of them are obvious go-to sources, like the Presidential Library Museum, which has a phenomenal collection known as the Charles Pearsall Collection. There's also the Hyde Park Library. The National Park Service has phenomenal images too in their collections. But then some collections even miraculously came to us. Some guy actually walked in on me at St. James Church when I was being asked to lead Wednesday morning prayer. And he came in and said, "Hey, I've got a really good photograph album from the Rogers estate, Crumwald." I said, "What? Where are you from, buddy?" "Baltimore. I got it at an auction." These images have never been seen, they've never been published before until now. So a lot of the images in this book are going to seem really familiar to you, and some you've never seen before. And I think we're very fortunate that the Gilded Age was so beautifully documented. And Hyde Park in particular had some really talented photographers, from Charles Pearsall to Mrs. Caroline Rogers, who took a lot of pictures of her children, much to their dismay, based on some of the photographs. Now, tonight, we're going to share with you some of these images and stories from our work. Not all of them, because you're going to have to buy the book. I mean, I can't show you everything. And we want to share some of the stories behind these photographs and even how we came to get some of these photographs in the process. And I think we'll show you a nice little spattering of images here, and we'll kind of go back and forth talking about each one as we go. I'm going to let the guy that everybody's here to see take it away first.
Well, what I'm going to do is explain first my outfit. This is an outfit that a worker would wear to church. All right, a nice clean shirt. But workers would also wear similar outfits to work. They'd wear a derby. They all had a hat on. Maybe it was. And Herb's given me the signal that he can't hear. This is being recorded for YouTube. So if you get home and you have a personal computer, you can find it on YouTube. So this, what are you saying, that the slides aren't light enough? What do we do about that?
We don't have any control over that. Somebody in the booth would have to do that.
Back in the projection booth, what's going on back? Can we get some of the lights off?
Maybe not. Cliff? Carry on.
We're going to carry on.
Like I said, buy the book.
All right, so this is, I'm going to try to follow along in the book. This is on page 10. It's the Dinsmore Mansion. The 90-room mansion was built in 1887, and now I can't read it in my book. All right. and lived in by a family until the 1940s. Helen Dinsmore Huntington demolished it in 1941 to make way for a new mansion, which still stands today. I forgot the name of the guy, but there was a famous book publisher, actually published pornography. Somebody knows. They don't want to admit it back there. All right. Okay, next slide. This is of great interest to me because I'm friends with the people that own that mansion now. It's the Howard House. Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt were close to many of their nieces and nephews,
And this house is a fine example of their love. Designed by Charles McKim in 1896, this was built for Thomas H. Howard, a nephew. Thomas's wife was victimized twice by bandits. First in 1904, when two highwaymen jumped in her sleigh and tried to rob her. The second attempt was successful for the other crooks. One night, about the time of World War I, a gang of robbers known as the Candle Gang, because they always left a candle stub at the scene, hit this mansion while Rose Howard was inside. The next day, Mrs. Howard left for her apartment in New York City and never returned to Hyde Park. This is on the hill behind Circle Drive. So it's right opposite the Vanderbilt Mansion. And those of you that have taken walks at the Vanderbilt Mansion, there's a tunnel that goes under Route 9. And that tunnel was so that the Howards and the Vanderbilts could visit each other. Okay, next slide. This is page 17. Oh, this is example of the upper crust in Hyde Park. This building is still there. It's a color slide, so it was a slide that I took. It's on West Market Street. And I titled all the photos have captions underneath them in the book. And the caption is, "Money marries money." This mansion was built by Frederick Vanderbilt for his friend, Colonel Edward Wales. It was the location of the wedding reception for Ruth Wales and Henry Francis DuPont in 1916, and was designed by the famous firm McKim, Mead, and White, who also designed the other Vanderbilt homes in the area. Today, this home has been completely restored by its current owners, and they're the friendliest, nicest people that are living there now, and they sunk a lot of money into restoring that house, and they should be congratulated. All right.
I'm going to do the next one.
Okay, here's Shannon. Speak into the
All right, so.
Herb will yell at you.
Oh, I don't want to get yelled at by Herb. Okay, so this Italianite beauty is the Drayton Sexton House. Now, this house is no longer standing, actually. And it was originally built by Joseph Curtis, who made his fortune in the gold rush. It has a 4-story tower, which you can just see in the back there, was 140 feet tall, which is one of the tallest parts of Hyde Park at the time. The house also included a library, a study, and a conservatory. However, Curtis apparently ran out of money in the process of building his house. So this is just before the Gilded Age. So then afterwards, Sylvia Livingston Drayton comes in, and she buys the house in the 1860s. She's got Livingston money. She is the daughter of Sylvia Depew Livingston and Mortimer Livingston. And she comes in and buys up the house, and it was quite grand in her time. She's also the one who will pay pretty much entirely for the construction of Regina Coeli Church, as one of the wealthiest Catholics in town at the time. When she died in 1882, the house was rented out by her heirs, and one of the people who rented it was actually Colonel Archibald Rogers. He was renting it while waiting for his house, Cromwell, to be created, which we're actually going to show you in a second. After Rogers moved out of the house, when his house was created, it was sold by the heirs of Sylvia Livingston Drayton to Samuel Sexton, and he lived it up until 1899 when it sadly burnt to the ground. The Vanderbilts bought that land at that point and leveled it. So if you're leaving Vanderbilt property, you're heading out the exit road, and there's the overlook parking area. The field on your right, just next to the overlook parking area, that's where that house once stood. So when a lot of people are sitting there with their picnics or playing Frisbee, can you imagine this beautiful Italianate castle essentially sitting on that hill? They also had, if you're heading down Bard Rock, down to Bard Rock, the road that leads there were greenhouses in that field as you're going down the hill to your left. There were beautiful greenhouses that they had. And then down at Bard Rock itself, there was a boathouse and a gardener's cottage as well. So all that is now long gone. But you can actually, if you're down at Bard Rock, you can see stone steps just right next to the bridge there. And that would have been from that house, as a matter of fact. Do you want to talk about Cromwell? Because I know you're the Cromwell guy.
The first book that I ever wrote was a biography of Archibald Rogers. It was very difficult to write it because he wasn't famous. I've told any other author, if you're going to write a biography, write about somebody who's famous so you can get some. But Cromwell, this is in the early stages. I don't think the family had moved in yet. There's still construction going on. And the little building on the right with a single chimney going up is the powerhouse. They had a coal dock down on the New York Central Railroad at where Rogers Point is right now. And they heated the entire mansion with central heating. And that's interesting because they've got a lot of chimneys too, and I think the chimneys were more for aesthetics than anything. Construction of Cromwell. In the 1880s, Archibald Rogers purchased various estates along the river just north of the Roosevelt property. The former estate of Elias Butler was torn down, and Richard Morris Hunt set to work designing a stone manor that became known as Cromwell. It took 5 years to complete the construction, which was done by Charles I. Rounds Company. Rogers and his wife, Anne Carolyn Coleman, moved into their new home in 1889. The Charles I. Rounds Company also built the Adrian's Library in Poughkeepsie. I don't know if it's the same kind of design or what, but it's beautiful inside the old part of the Adrian's Library. Do you want to? I think we're going to just go back and forth here.
This is a really great aerial view of Cromwell. This image was actually taken just about, thank you, I'm much taller than you are. This image was taken right about the time of World War II, actually, by aerial photographers who were photographing the place because this was going to become the headquarters of the 240th Military Battalion during World War II. They were stationed there to take care of the president. But anyway, you can make out the mansion. Let's see, we got a pointer here. Here's the mansion, here's the power center here, and then over here we have some of the gardens. The stables are still there today, though they're not in the best of shape from what I can tell. This house over here is beautifully restored and currently the home of Sue Serino. There's a couple other great houses over in this general area. My house is over here. Just after the war, as FDR had wished, he had actually written that he had hoped that someday the Rogers place would be more than just a big mansion and a farm. He hoped that it would be a community. He hoped that people would settle there and that it would be housing and gardens. And, well, that happened thanks to the Goldens. Just after the war, houses started popping up in 49, 50, including many of ours. So this estate right now, of course, a lot of you know that it had become the Amard Seminary later on. And I've spoken to lots of locals who said that they remember going swimming there and how nice the brothers were. But now it's kind of in private hands, and we're not entirely sure the condition of the mansion at this point. But the Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the house, was a very, very prominent architect, and he's also the same architect who designed the Biltmore, the Vanderbilt house down in the Carolinas. You want to do this one?
This is Placentia. It means place of peace, I guess in Italian, maybe. And this home belonged to various wealthy men of Hyde Park, including Judge Nathaniel Pendleton, who is best known to history as the second to Alexander Hamilton in the famous Hamilton-Burr duel. Later, a writer named James Kirk Paulding lived here. This James Kirk Paulding, along with Washington Irving and one other man, I think William Irving, Washington's brother, they wrote Salmagundi newspaper stories, or column, I guess. They were columnists in the 1800s. This lovely home, with its sweeping view of the Hudson River, would be a victim of fire in October 1900. And this was right at a time, 1899, 1900, when firebugs were running around Hyde Park, arsonists, and a lot of the grand old buildings that happened to be vacant at the time with the owners down in New York City or Newport, they just got torched by arsonists, and we didn't have a very good fire department back then either.
I think they also set the fire department on fire, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the firebugs also managed to set the actual fire department on fire, but not only that, they decided to chain the fire trucks to the ground so that it couldn't actually be fixed. So that was a major problem. There were a lot of important buildings that caught on fire in the course of the late 19th, early 20th century in Hyde Park. This is Manswood, which was originally built in 1810. It was a much smaller building at that time. It was built for Reverend Dr. John McVicker, who was the rector at St. James Church at the time. This mansion was enlarged during the Gilded Age in 1906 to 1907 with straight and simple lines, much more simpler than the original sort of Italianite house that it had once been during McVicker's time. It was done by Francis Landon. It was done for Francis Landon, who lived here, also a member of St. James Church. In 1917, electrical lights were installed, which is fairly late in the game for most of the houses in Hyde Park. They had electricity by the 1890s, many of them. At least the fancy mansions did, anyway. Of all the Hudson River mansions, this one has the best view. This one had the best view of Esopus Island, which was just out in front of it. The mansion sadly was torn down in 2014 for the Anderson Center for Autism. So now apparently it's the site of benches and a park bench, unfortunately. But yeah, that was Manswood. This is one of the images that came to us via a guy who came into the visitor center one day, a lovely young man who had a whole collection of rare Hyde Park postcards. So some of the images in the book are actually postcards, and it was very kind of him to do that for us. This is one of my favorite images. It shows a very intimate scene, and so those of you who have wandered around here in the visitor center, if you make your way all the way to the back here, there's an exhibit on the wall that tells you a little bit more about this family. These are the Newbolds. That is Sarah with her two children, Mary and Thomas Newbold. And ever since I started working here, I worked here years ago as a park ranger, I've always liked this image because it just shows a mother's tender love for her children. It's just shining through in this great and intimate photograph. Sarah Lawrence Coolidge, the woman here, she's a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson, actually. She married lawyer and New York State Senator Thomas Newbold. And together in 1885, they purchased Belfield, the house just out front here. They had three children. These are the first two. Mary Edith. She's actually named after her distant cousin, Edith Wharton. And of course, Edith Wharton is a famous novelist of the Gilded Age, and she also wrote a fabulous book on the Gilded Age interiors, decorating these houses. So Edith Wharton was actually the professional when it came to the ostentatious lifestyles that some of these folks were living. But anyway, so the little girl here is named after her. And then Thomas Jefferson Newbold, the little boy there, named after his ancestor. These kids grew up right next door to FDR, who was growing up the same time they were. They're the same age, and they were very close friends. This image is right about 1887, so it's really a great Gilded Age image. While these two were, at least while Thomas was off to college, his mother, Sarah, and her husband were busy working on hiring McKim, Mead, and White to expand their house, Belfield. Belfield would get a major expansion around 1905, 1910, as well as adding the Beatrix Ferran garden, which is there, and just a beautiful property. If you haven't at least walked around the exterior of Belfield and seen the Beatrix Ferran gardens, I certainly hope you do, because it is quite a beautiful sight to see. The next great image that I love to showcase here are these lovely ladies. And I do mean quite literally ladies. This is Lady Moira and Lady Elaine Forbes with their head horseman at Statsburg. That's George Saggs there. These are the daughters of Beatrix Forbes and the granddaughters of Ogden Mills. So Beatrix Forbes, of course, Beatrix Mills, grew up at Statsburg. That was her childhood home. And she goes off, and in the Gilded Age, it was very common for lords of England, royalty of England, to marry wealthy American girls. And this is exactly what happened in this case. Their mother would end up marrying Bernard, the Earl of Grenard. I love that. Bernard, the Earl of Grenard, in 1909. And these girls were both actually had the title of lady because of their mother's marriage. So what happens in a lot of these cases, in these marriages, these wealthy women, they end up marrying these lords, they go over to England, they get these titles, and these gentlemen, they get their heirs' money to restore their castles and things like, they're depleting homesteads in England, which is exactly what the Mills money ended up doing for this guy. So these girls, no doubt, were visiting their grandfather, Ogden Mills, and their grandmother, Ruth Livingston Mills, at Statsburg when this photograph was snapped before heading back home to London. You want to talk about this one, Carney?
Well, what page are we on?
Oh, I don't know. There you go.
Okay, I found it. This is Mrs. Rogers with family. Sitting in a carriage at the front door of Cromwell is Ann Coleman Rogers and her brother Robert Coleman. Her two children, Edmund and Ellen, are standing nearby. Life at Cromwell usually involved pleasant rides in carriages across their large estate and into town. It was a chance to show off one's fashion and elegant horses. Edmund, the boy on the left, was best friends with FDR. I think we have another story about his brother Archibald Rogers, who passed away.
We do, actually. Well,
All right.
let's see. Oh, we just had to throw that
Okay, well, that's not his brother. Let's see if I can find that page.
There we go. Can't have a good
Oh, here we are. Rogers Hounds, not brothers. Southwest of the Cromwell stables were a building and enclosure for Archibald Rogers Hounds. Every year, the Hudson River gentry, dressed in their bright red costumes, riding on muscular horses, followed this pack of frantic hounds. They would race cross-country, jumping stone walls and fences, while most of the women would watch and cheer as they more politely followed up Violet Avenue. A dead fox or scent bag would have been purposely dragged near the road to afford a better view to the spectators. Several sightseers would be seated in an English coach facing each other. The coachman would ride in front on the box seat, high up, and the footmen rode in the rear, taking turns blowing shrill notes on a long tapered coach horn. So that's what these hounds did. That was their purpose. but they were treated real well, and the Hudson River gentry really loved their horses almost as much as they loved their family. Okay, next slide.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Archie. Archie Rogers Jr. I'll take the microphone so Herb doesn't yell at me. This little boy with the sailboat here is Archie Rogers Jr. Now, when this image was taken in 1888, Archie was the same age as his very dear friend, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were even tutored together in a little room at Crumwold. FDR, his father, would take him in a carriage just down the street to Crumwold, where he would sit with the Rogers kids, and they would all be tutored together. Clearly, based on this photograph, Archie had the same passion for sailing and sailboats that FDR had. It was a very common thing with these Hudson River families. Sadly, a year after this photograph was taken, Archie Jr. died from diphtheria, which was a very common and mostly fatal illness for folks in the Gilded Age time period, the late 19th century. It was very painful, certainly a hard way to go. And he's not the only one, of course. We also know that Eleanor Roosevelt's mother had died from diphtheria, and so did her little brother Elliot as well. So it was a common illness that hit rich and poor alike. And Archie, poor little Archie here, would just die just a year after this image. But this image, as well as this one here of the party that's going on, were in this photograph, this family photo album that came to me. Like I said, I was literally, like God was answering my prayers, because I was in church praying when this guy comes in from Baltimore and says, "Hey, I've got all these really great images, and I think you're going to like them." So he was very nice, very, very kind of him to share with me this great family photo album of the Rogers family at Crumwold. And this costume party is all the Rogers kids grown up with some of their friends and spouses. And this is a party that's actually happening in Crumwold, actually, in the mansion. They had these huge parties. Over 100 members of high society from Dutchess County and beyond were represented. The Astors, the Huntingtons, the Dinsmores, Chandlers, Landons, Roosevelts, Hoyts, Millses, Vanderbilts, they all came to these parties. They would waltz on the front hall, the dance hall at Crumwold, and drink champagne and toast at midnight, and it was usually a rollicking good time. So I just love this great image, especially the brother kind of mocking the other one with his hand on his head here, and just going, "Hey, all right, stay down there, little bro." It's just it's a great family photograph that we wanted to share. I'll let you do the field day.
Okay, this photo was taken in 1910. I guess you can read that. But it was in East Park, and it used to be, oh no, my memories. I'm going to try to find it. In East Park, it was called Union Corners. How could I forget that? This photograph was taken on what today is the Union Corners Cemetery. I think the Russian Orthodox Church is right in the center of where this track was. Back during the Gilded Age, the area was used as a horse racetrack and parade ground. Wealthy estate owners, as well as local common folk, would come to Union Corners, now East Park, to show their horses. It must have been a hot day. Note the ladies' parasols in the audience. Can you see? They're not umbrellas, they're parasols. And some of the wealthy ladies would pay as much as $5,000 for a parasol just to show off their wealth. I don't know if they did that here in Hyde Park, but... Okay, next.
Okay, so this one, this is Gerald Livingston Hoyt and his wife Mary Appleton Hoyt. The Hoyts enjoyed life at this wonderful house that we know as either Hoyt House or the Point, as it's known. It's actually Gerald Livingston Hoyt, his mother and father had this house built. Geraldine Livingston, who of course from the prominent Livingston family, and her husband Ludwig Hoyt had the house designed in the 1850s by famous architect Calvert Vall. And the house, by the time of the Gilded Age, was more or less out of style. And in all honesty, a cottage compared to the Statsburg house right next door, which had by that point gotten a major renovation. So it's a perfect example of a Gilded Age cottage, if you will. And if you've walked through the woods in Norrie Point and Mills, you'll find the Hoyt house now quite in disrepair. And at some point, hopefully it could be restored and brought back to its former glory. But this is a great image taken by Charles Pearsall. And Charles Pearsall was a High Parker. He was apparently a man of many talents. If you're on Market Street, right across from Cranberry's Cafe, if you're standing at the door of Cranberry's Cafe and you look right across, there's that nail salon, and then a tiny little house right next to it. That was Charles Pearsall's house. And in his day, not only was he a photographer, but he was also the town's fishmonger and bicycle repairman, so multi-talented guy. And he was allowed beautiful access into some of these families' estates and took some really great images. So he apparently got the Hoyts to come out and, well, kind of sort of say cheese, anyway. You want to talk about Ellen Roosevelt?
Okay. Ellen Roosevelt was first cousin to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. People tend to think of the Roosevelts as political leaders, but some of the family preferred to live a lavish lifestyle without worldly problems. Ellen, the daughter of John Aspinwall Roosevelt, was born at Rosedale in 1868. She was first cousin of FDR. Ellen preferred tennis as her sport of choice, and she beat out the previous champion, Bertha Townsend, in 1880 at the U.S. Tennis Championship. She and her sister Grace also won that year in the doubles match. And Rosedale is right behind, up on the hill, behind where Windsor Lumber used to be. If any of you remember Windsor Lumber, down by the gym, Planet Fitness. If any of you go to Planet Fitness, I doubt it. All right. Anyway.
All right.
Okay.
Let me tackle the next one here. Now, in this book, we wanted to also kind of look at some of the spiritual institutions that were paid for specifically, or paid for and also maintained by some of the wealthiest families in Hyde Park. This image was taken on May 16th, 1913. Something else was happening in 1913, the 16th Amendment, which was officially going to end the Gilded Age with income tax. That would change everything. But this is the wedding of Anne Rogers, Archibald Rogers' daughter, to John Griswold Webb. And this is, you can see, this is from an angle from St. James Church looking out, and you can just make out the senator, John Griswold Webb, getting into this car. You can see the smiling faces. You can almost hear the cheers coming off of this image as the husband and wife are coming out, or bride and groom are coming out of the St. James Church. One of the things that I love about this image is that it's also a symbol of change in the era, the automobiles and the carriages. Because clearly you've got mostly automobiles here in 1913. But back here you can just make out 2 coachmen and 2 heads of horses. So there's clearly a carriage, there's an old-timer in town who's not ready to move on to the automobiles, and so brought their horse and carriage to this wonderful event. But then you got all these other vehicles out here, and it's quite a momentous occasion. Now, many of you probably remember this church. This is the original Regina Coeli, built in the 1860s entirely with Livingston funds. This was built by Sylvia Depew Livingston, and her daughter, who we talked about before, Sylvia Livingston Drayton. They pretty much single-handedly paid for the construction of this church in the 1860s, but we don't know exactly how much they spent, and we don't know who designed the church. We just know it was built in a beautiful Gothic style. We also know that the church was furnished almost entirely by the Livingston ladies, with the exception of one painting, which still exists in the new Regina Coeli today, a massive copy of the Murillo Madonna and Child that's hanging over the choir loft, and that was a gift from none other than the infamous Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Why exactly Sarah Delano Roosevelt gave that painting to the church remains a mystery. I did some research, and I discovered that Sarah certainly loved the image of the Madonna and Child. You can see many images in the Roosevelt home if you walk through it. And in 1882, after Sarah gave birth to her son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the Roosevelt cousins blurted out, "Doesn't she look just like the Madonna and Child?" So she must have taken that quite literally and decided to collect those images. So anyway, that's Regina Coeli. This is St. Margaret's Church, a modern photograph of St. Margaret's, which is in Statsburg, and this was built with the funds of two families, the Millses and the Dinsmores. This particular church was built in 1891, completed in 1892, and the architect of this church is Richard Mitchell Upjohn, who designed quite a few churches. Some of the stained glass that's in this church actually goes back to the 16th century and was brought over from France just about the time of World War I by Ogden Mills and donated to the church. It's a really fabulous church. If you ever get a chance to go inside, it's quite beautiful. You want to take over at the Harrington House?
I did want to say a little bit about St. Margaret's Church. Ogden Mills had purchased a 125-room mansion on 8 acres in Paris, France, just before World War I. And the American headquarters during World War I was in that mansion. And after World War I, the church, the nation of France, gave 2 of the windows that wound up in St. Margaret's Church. And it's just amazing that somebody that lived in Statsburg, his mansion in Paris, was headquarters for the Americans during World War I. I'm always amazed at the connection between the Hudson Valley and world history, but you've got to dig it out, and sometimes it really surprises you. And that was a big surprise to me when we were researching this little bitty church that had a connection to American headquarters in Paris. Okay, this is the Harrington House. What page is that on, Shannon?
That's a good question. 97.
97, all right, 97. And Ed Harrington was the superintendent on the Rogers Place. With the knowledge and the experience he gained through that position, he then moved up the road to become the first superintendent on the Vanderbilt estate. His home, which still stands today, minus the picket fence, is on Main Street. This is number 4 Main Street. It's the annex for the Hyde Park Library. It doesn't have that porch on it anymore. It's just a straight wall. And I wanted this in the book, in the program. I guess Shannon knew what I was going to do, but that's my house. That's 6 Main Street. That's where Tatiana and Peter and I live. But I got the rear window on the 2nd floor and the window on the 3rd floor, so that's my house. Built in 1842. Okay, do you want me to do this one, Shannon? All right, I got to find the page, though.
I think it's past the everything else.
Okay, this is pavement work down at the south entrance to the Vanderbilt Mansion, down past where the river, the bridge over the Crum Elbow Creek is closed off now, but anybody can walk around the barricades and get in there. But this is the south entrance, and I'll explain what they're doing. Pavement work. Gilded Age construction and maintenance at the large river estates in Hyde Park required a tremendous amount of skilled and non-skilled laborers. Of the approximately 600 people living in the hamlet, nearly every person was dependent on estate wages in one way or another. Here, workers are leveling forms and pouring concrete near one of the gates at the Vanderbilt Mansion using a tip wagon. After working for hours at this hard labor, they would ride their bicycles home. And you can see the bicycles, but this one thing I asked John Golden was, how did the workers get back and forth? Did they have a bus or something? And he said, oh no. At quitting time, you would see a whole gang of people riding up and down the Albany Post Road, which is now Route 9, workers coming home. Sometimes they'd come home for lunch if they lived very close to the estates, riding their bicycles. Okay.
I'll let you tackle that one.
Okay. I guess Shannon put me in charge of the construction. This is driving a well pipe at Crumwald. Other well construction work during Gilded Age was extremely dangerous. This wasn't so dangerous, but other well construction was. One or two men would be lowered into the hole to dig, and sometimes they would become victims of a cave-in. The hole would be lined with large rocks, and water would be pumped to an iron storage tower on a high elevation of the estate. They all had and the towers are still there. They're in the woods east of Route 9 for all three estates. Okay, next. Do you want to do this?
I can do this one, sure thing. All right, so a lot of you probably already know what this is, especially if you've ever headed down the road across the street from Vanderbilt. This is the Vanderbilt Creamery, and this is, many of the large estates were essentially farms. And many of them were self-sufficient. They had their own food, they had their own supplies, and they could take care of themselves. This was actually the Vanderbilt Creamery. Vanderbilt was famous for their cows and their cream and their ice cream in particular. And the Vanderbilt Creamery had thick stone and brick walls and a strong ceiling with beams on the first floor to hold the ice blocks up on the second floor. And it kept the building incredibly cold, so it actually was a great place to work if you were a servant in the summertime. On the inside of the creamery, which I didn't put a picture of here, but it's in the book, we actually, if you go inside you can just barely make it out in the book, the De Laval cream separator. De Laval was a company in Poughkeepsie, and actually the Dutchess County Historical Society, which I worked for, has a fabulous collection of photographs of the De Laval factory, which we now have. The building still stands today, of course, and it's wired for electricity and is now a private residence. This is the Statsburg crew. These talented men and one boy. There's one little kid in the back here who's apparently the water boy. They worked in 1895 and 1896 renovating the old Livingston Mansion, commonly known today as Statsburg or Mills Mansion. These guys helped create 65 rooms, 14 bathrooms, 23 fireplaces, all for a mere $350,000. Now, that's a 1895 money, which apparently translates to about a little over $10 million today. Considering it's pretty cheap, so I'm imagining the labor was below minimum wage. This is yet another McKim, Mead, and White project. This is done in the Beaux-Arts style, and the McKim, Mead, and White firm was very busy here in Hyde Park in the 1890s and up into about 1910 or so. Not only doing all the houses for the Vanderbilt estate, their carriage barns, the Howard House, the Colonel Edward, goodness, what's his name now? Colonel Edward, why can't I remember his name? Yeah, there it is, Colonel Edward Wales' house. They also redesigned Belfield and Statsburg. So this particular firm was very, very busy in this area, expanding all these big, beautiful mansions. Statsburg, like Vanderbilt, these two houses truly embody the whole effect the Gilded Age had on interior and exterior designs and lifestyles. And it's just this crew, it's sad that we don't know who any of these people are. Their stories are not known, they're not told, but we can imagine that these guys were the best of the best. And they were all skilled craftsmen and a very patient water boy in the center. You want to take on this little shop here? Okay.
The L.S. Hover store at Cowman's Row. Looking a bit like a Western movie set, these people and dog are relaxing in front of a typical general store in the row of wooden structures attached. I'm having trouble with the lighting for some reason. Attached to each other at the west side of the Albany Post Road between the new fire station and Main Street. Now, if you picture where the town hall is now, and Albany Post Road and Route 9 out in front of the town hall, that whole block, the front lawn of the town hall is where this store was, along with a bunch of other stores. It was a busy part of Hyde Park during the Gilded Age. There was a saloon, billiard parlor, ice cream parlor, a jewelry store, restaurant with banquet room, liquor store, and dance hall. I had a question, but I did research it, and there was a jewelry store in there. I don't know why. It didn't fit in with the other clientele. Each place had an apartment above. The row was always considered a fire trap. Amazingly, it lasted from the 1840s to the winter of 1967 when it finally burned down.
Let's see. You want to do that or should I?
Okay, I'll read this one too. We're getting close to the end here. Hyde Park Defense Unit. The beginning of World War I seemed to mark the beginning of the end of the Gilded Age and the world of opulent lifestyles. Here the men of Hyde Park march in a parade in Poughkeepsie just after the war. Many of the wealthy families contributed money and supplies to this unit, including the Morgans, Vanderbilts, Rogers, and Roosevelts. When I say supplies, all of the uniforms were purchased by the wealthy families. And I don't know, I'm assuming these men didn't go to war. They were the home guard. It was like the National Guard that stayed in America during World War I. But it probably cost somebody a lot of money to buy all those uniforms. Okay, Shannon?
Okay. There are actually two guys in here that I know for sure actually ended up going over and serving. And I think they both have these little red markers over here. This guy went, and this guy over here also went and served in the war, and both came back. Though Hyde Park and Statsburg did lose a few men during the war. A couple of guys from the area did actually die. One actually, I believe, died on the way over to serve in the war. The ship sank, and another one died from illness while serving over there. Yeah, this is the best example of what's essentially the end of the Gilded Age, because now everybody, the wealthy and their workers, are serving together in the same endeavor. So it kind of took away that barrier that had been there for so long. This is the Howard House today. Whoops. The Howard House today, it's been fully restored and is in immaculate condition. And so it hasn't really changed too much since the Vanderbilt nephew had lived there back in its heyday. This is a photograph that Carney took, because as he said, he's friends with the folks who own it now. I love this image because it shows you then and now. The house that you see here was actually a shepherd's cottage for Crumwald. It was part of the Rogers estate. A couple of the farmers, the sheep herders, lived in this house. And nowadays, of course, it's the antique shop that we all know and love. I think that's a great example of kind of then and now. Another building that, if you can think of, it's in the book, is that long, narrow building right alongside the McDonald's, which is now an all-state insurance building and apartments. And that was actually stables for visiting horses. People who came to visit the Rogers brought their horses with them, and Rogers was particularly strict about who his horses mingled with. So
You have that slide?
no, I didn't. You have to buy the book. Rogers wanted to keep his horses separate from visiting horses, so that stable, which is now apartments and insurance building, that's in the book as well. And then, of course, Vanderbilt today. As I said before, Vanderbilt is really one of the places that embodies the Gilded Age, that whole era of ostentatious lifestyles and the rich and the locals sort of working together to make this society happen. And Vanderbilt, of course, this is one of the places that attracts people to Hyde Park to come and see it. Not just the fact that we have a presidential home, that of course is the main draw, but I think that this extra era of opulence is also very neat and helps to give Hyde Park its character. And I think we're very fortunate that we have so many great places that have been preserved and can be visited that make Hyde Park so unique. So, any other last thoughts?
Shannon and I have been invited to have book signings at the Hyde Park Library, the Statsburg Library, and even at Cranberry's. So if they run out of books tonight here, we'll have books at those signings also. So, and I do want to thank the National Park Service and especially Cliff Lobby for putting up with us for a while here.
Okay, so I know Carney's done this a million times, but for me, this is like my first real author experience. And so I'm going to be a super geek, and I'm going to take a picture of this crazy, wonderful crowd. So,
Tatiana, your camera. Give me your camera.
everybody say history! Are we taking questions? Any questions? Comments? Concerns? Yeah, question.
Do you know the origin of the name Rhinevault?
Origin of the name Crumwald.
Do you know that one?
Yes, I do. Wald means woods. In fact, Rhinevault used to be Rhinewald, woods along the Rhine. And Crumwald meant woods along the Crumwald Creek. And the estate at one time did touch the Crumwald Creek. And there was also a story about FDR wanted Springwood renamed to say, for the word Crumwald. Crum Elbow, yes. All right, she corrected me. And that got into another story about his friend across the river who was actually an enemy. They already had Crum Elbow over there. So, Cliff has a microphone, so I know a lot of you can't shout as loud as the rest of us.
Oh, sorry, that was really loud.
That's okay. That's okay.
What was your favorite family to research?
Oh.
I'll let you answer.
Well, I'm biased because I've always been fascinated with the Roosevelts. I know this book doesn't really cover the Roosevelts that much at all because I wanted to. For the Roosevelts, I feel they're more of a political family and less so on the Gilded Age side of things. The Vanderbilts are fascinating, but I think one of the greatest things about this whole book was actually getting that photograph album from the Rogers family. The Rogers, a lot of people don't realize how much land the Rogers actually had here in Hyde Park and how much they contributed to Hyde Park, helping to build the town hall, helping to contribute to St. James Church. The Rogers family had a lot of money. Well, to be more specific, Rogers' wife, Caroline Coleman, had a lot of money. So he hit the jackpot when he married her. I think the family photograph album, which has so many great images of the Rogers kids growing up, like Caroline really kind of went over the top photographing her kids. And like I said, in some of the images, the kids are like, "Mom, really? Another picture? Great," you know. So I think the Rogers, for me, are the most fascinating. And I think they're a family that needs to be studied more. Carney got the ball rolling when he wrote a book about Crumwald, one of his first books, I think. Yes. And I think that needs to be explored further. What about you?
My favorite people in the researching was the Vanderbilts. And I wrote a whole chapter about odd Vanderbilt stories. I think her name was Lucille Vanderbilt. Did I get that right? Louise? One or the other. Anyway, she was a status climber for sure. And it was just amazing that the Vanderbilts were new money. There was a big difference during the Gilded Age between old money and new money. The old money they had generally made their money by trading, some of them by trading opium, going to China and making tons of money along with tons of opium. And the new money was generally the industrial age with railroads and things like that. You've heard of robber barons? Well, that was during the Gilded Age. Jay Gould and Boss Tweed, they were all new money. So that's my favorite research.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this and congratulations on your research. Did you come across anything that dealt with the music making that was so popular during the Gilded Age? Important guests, people that came up from New York City, and anything of that nature?
There was, I think, a story about a regimental band in there, right? At the
Yes.
Rogers costume party.
The costume parties and the New Year parties that the Rogers had, they were famous because they stuck around always for Christmas. In fact, I'm not sure if they even had a place in New York City like the other rich people. But the Frank Schofield 21st Regimental Band would play at New Year parties at the Rogers Estate, Crumwald. And they would, in my book, but I can't remember now. There were a whole list of songs that they played, but it wasn't pop rock. I'll tell you that. It was pretty waltzes and stuff like that. But that's what we had here in Hyde Park. One more question, I guess.
Thank you very much for this tonight. It's so important to the county history. Shannon knows that we appreciate that very much. Thank you very much, sir, as well. I have a kind of like a two-part. First, it's just altogether very exciting that someone came forward with the album, because I mean, photographs are photo documentation for our local history.
Yeah.
And I think you raise a really good point, and it's a good time to encourage people to contact their local historians or whomever they might know if they have images, documents that they can share, so that history can be, fulfilled and we can all, share in it and maintain it for the future. That's the first part. The second is, I'm just wondering, with the book and your research, if either one of you had the opportunity to speak with and contact any current descendants of any of the families.
Don't you know someone from the, yeah.
Yes, I got to speak with Curtis Roosevelt when he was alive, of course. And David Eisenhower, and there was a guy that called me that lived at the Belfield. What was it?
From the Morgan family.
The Morgan, Gerald Morgan Jr., I guess. And he's the one that owned Belfield, and the field between Belfield and Capolo's, that open field, he owned that until he passed away. He gave it in his will to the National Park Service. I think I've got that correct. She's shaking her head, so she's a National Park Service expert. So I did get to speak to those. And this Gerald Morgan, he told me about these parties that they had at Cromwald. He would go to these parties, and he said that was back when they had these huge Christmas trees with real candles on them. And the butler for the Rogers he had 2 buckets of water, and he would stand near that Christmas tree. Everybody else was having fun opening Christmas presents, and he was there with those 2 buckets and a nervous expression on his face while the party was going on.
All right, folks, why don't you give another nice round of applause to our speakers. And we'll meet you out in the lobby for the book signing.